Chapter 13 of Nina Balatka by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. For 2 days after this Nina heard nothing from the Jews' quarter, and in her terrible distress her heart almost became softened towards the man who had so deeply offended her. She began to tell herself, in the weariness of her sorrow, that men were different from women, and of their nature more suspicious, that no woman had a right to expect every virtue in her lover, and that no woman had less of such right than she herself, who had so little to give in return for all that Anton proposed to bestow upon her. She began to think that she could forgive him even for his suspicion, if he would only come to be forgiven. But he came not, and it was only too plain to her that she could not be the first to go to him after what had passed between them. And then there fell another crushing sorrow upon her. Her father was ill, so ill that he was like to die. The doctor came to him, some son of Galen who had known the merchant in his prosperity, and with kind assurances told Nina that her father, though he could pay nothing, should have whatever assistance medical attention could give him. But he said at the same time that medical attention could give no aid that would be of permanent service. The light had burned down in the socket and must go out. The doctor took Nina by the hand and put his own hand upon her soft tresses, and spoke kind words to console her. And then he said that the sick man ought to take a few glasses of wine every day, and as he was going away turned back again and promised to send the wine from his own house. Nina thanked him and plucked up something of her old spirit during his presence, and spoke to him as though she had no other care than that of her father's health. But as soon as the doctor was gone she thought again of her Jew lover. That her father should die was a great grief, but when she should be alone in the old house with the corpse lying on the bed, would Anton Trendellsohn come to her then? He did not come to her now, though he knew of her father's illness. She sent Souchey to the Jews' quarter to tell the sad news, not to him but to old Trendellsohn. For the sake of the property it is right that he should know, Nina said to herself, excusing to herself on this plea her weakness in sending any message to the house of Anton Trendellsohn till he should have come and asked her pardon. But even after this he came not. She listened to every footstep that entered the courtyard. She could not keep herself from going to the window and from looking into the square. Surely now, in her deep sorrow, in her solitude, he would come to her. He would come and say one word, that he did trust her, that he would trust her. But no, he came not at all. And the hours of the day and the night followed slowly and surely upon each other, as she sat by her father's bed, watching the last quiver of the light in the socket. But though Trendellsohn did not come himself, there came to her a messenger from the Jew's house, a messenger from the Jew's house, but not a messenger from Anton Trendellsohn. "Here is a girl from the Jew," said Souchey, whispering into her ear as she sat at her father's bedside. "One of themselves. Shall I tell her to go away because he is so ill?" And Souchey pointed to his master's head on the pillow. "She has got a basket, but she can leave that." Nina, however, was by no means inclined to send the Jewess away, rightly guessing that the stranger was her friend Ruth. "Stop here, Souchey, and I will go to her," Nina said. "Do not leave him till I return. I will not be long." She would not have let a dog go without a word that had come from Anton's house or from Anton's presence. Perhaps he had written to her. If there were but a line to say, "Pardon me, I was wrong," everything might yet be right. But Ruth Jacobi was the bearer of no note from Anton, nor indeed had she come on her present message with her uncle's knowledge. She had put a heavy basket on the table, and now running forward took Nina by the hand and kissed her. "We have been so sorry, all of us, to hear of your father's illness," said Ruth. "Father is very ill," said Nina. "He is dying." "Nay, Nina, it may be that he is not dying. Life and death both are in the hands of God." "Yes, it is in God's hands, of course, but the doctor says that he will die." "The doctors have no right to speak in that way," said Ruth, "for how can they know God's pleasure? It may be that he will recover." "Yes, it may be," said Nina. "It is good of you to come to me, Ruth. I am so glad you have come. Have you any message?" If he would only ask to be forgiven through Ruth, or even if he had sent a word that might be taken to show that he wished to be forgiven, it should suffice. "I have brought a few things in a basket," said Ruth, almost apologetically. Then Nina lifted the basket. "You did not surely carry this through the streets?" "I had Shadrach, our boy, with me. He carried it. It is not from me exactly, though I have been so glad to come with it." "And who sent it?" said Nina quickly, with her fingers trembling on its lid. If Anton had thought to send anything to her, that anything should suffice. "It was Rebecca Loth who thought of it, and who asked me to come," said Ruth. Then Nina drew back her fingers as though they were burned, and walked away from the table with quick angry steps. "Why should Rebecca Loth send anything to me?" she said. "What is there in the basket?" "She has written a little line. It is at the top. But she has asked me to say—" "What has she asked you to say? Why should she say anything to me?" "Nay, Nina, she is very good, and she loves you." "I do not want her love." "I am to say to you that she has heard of your distress, and she hopes that a girl like you will let a girl like her do what she can to comfort you." "She cannot comfort me." "She bade me say that if she were ill or in sorrow, there is no hand from which she would so gladly take comfort as from yours, for the sake, she said, of a mutual friend." I have no friend," said Nina. "Oh, Nina, am not I your friend? Do not I love you?" "I do not know. If you do love me now, you must cease to love me. You are a Jewess and I am a Christian, and we must live apart. You at least must live. I wish you would tell the boy that he may take back the basket." "There are things in it for your father, Nina. And, Nina, surely you will read Rebecca's note." Then Ruth went to the basket, and from the top she took out Rebecca's letter, and gave it to Nina, and Nina read it. It was as follows: "I shall always regard you as very dear to me, because our hearts have been turned in the same way. It may not be perhaps that we shall know each other much at first, but I hope the days may come when we shall be much older than we are now, and that then we may meet and be able to talk of what has passed without pain. I do not know why a Jewess and a Christian woman should not be friends. I have sent a few things which may perhaps be of comfort to your father. In pity to me, do not refuse them. They are such as one woman should send to another, and I have added a little trifle for your own use. At the present moment you are poor as to money, though so rich in the gifts which make men love. On my knees before you I ask you to accept from my hand what I send, and to think of me as one who would serve you in more things if it were possible. Yours, if you will let me, affectionately, Rebecca. I see when I look at them that the shoes will be too big." She stood for a while apart from Ruth, with the open note in her hand, thinking whether or no she would accept the gifts which had been sent. The words which Rebecca had written had softened her heart, especially those in which the Jewess had spoken openly to her of her poverty. "At the present moment you are poor as to money," the girl had said, and had said it as though such poverty were, after all, but a small thing in their relative positions one to another. That Nina should be loved and Rebecca not loved was a much greater thing. For her father's sake she would take the things sent, and for Rebecca's sake she would take even the shoes which she wanted so sorely. She remembered well, as she read the last word, how, when Rebecca had been with her, she herself had pointed to the poor broken slippers which she wore, not meaning to excite such compassion as had now been shown. Yes, she would accept it all, as one woman should take such things from another. "You will not make Shadrach carry them back?" said Ruth, imploring her. "But has he sent nothing? Not a word?" She would have thought herself to be utterly incapable, before Ruth had come, of showing so much weakness, but her reserve gave way as she admitted in her own heart the kindness of Rebecca, and she became conquered and humbled. She was so terribly in want of his love at this moment. "And has he sent no word of a message to me?" "I did not tell him that I was coming." "But he knows that father is so ill." "Yes, I suppose he has heard that, because Souchey came to the house. But he has been out of temper with us all, and unhappy for some days past. I know that he is unhappy when he is so harsh with us." "And what has made him unhappy?" "Nay, I cannot tell you that. I thought perhaps it was because you did not come to him. You used to come and see us at our house." Dear Ruth, dearest Ruth, for saying such dear words! She had done more than Rebecca by the sweetness of the suggestion. If it were really the case that he were unhappy because they had parted from each other in anger, no further forgiveness would be necessary. "But how can I come, Ruth?" she said. "It is he that should come to me. You used to come." "Ah, yes. I came first with messages from father, and then because I loved to hear him talk to me. I do not mind telling you, Ruth, now. And then I came because he said I was to be his wife. I thought that if I was to be his wife it could not be wrong that I should go to his father's house. But now that so many people know it, that they talk about it so much, I cannot go to him now." "But you are not ashamed of being engaged to him because he is a Jew?" "No," said Nina, raising herself to her full height. "I am not ashamed of him. I am proud of him. To my thinking there is no man like him. Compare him and Ziska becomes hardly a man at all. I am very proud to think that he has chosen me." "That is well spoken, and I shall tell him." "No, you must not tell him, Ruth. Remember that I talk to you as a friend and not as a child." "But I will tell him, because then his brow will become smooth, and he will be happy. He likes to think that people know him to be clever, and he will be glad to be told that you understand him." "I think him greater and better than all men. But, Ruth, you must not tell him what I say, not now at least, for a reason." "What reason, Nina?" "Well, I will tell you, though I would not tell any one else in the world. When we parted last I was angry with him, very angry with him." "He had been scolding you, perhaps?" "I should not mind that, not in the least. He has a right to scold me." "He has a right to scold me, I suppose, but I mind it very much." "But he has no right to distrust me, Ruth. I wish he could see my heart and all my mind, and know every thought in my breast, and then he would feel that he could trust me. I would not deceive him by a word or a look for all the world. He does not know how true I am to him, and that kills me." "I will tell him everything." "No, Ruth, tell him nothing. If he cannot find it out without being told, telling will do no good. If you thought a person was a thief, would you change your mind because the person told you he was honest? He must find it out for himself if he is ever to know it." When Ruth was gone, Nina knew that she had been comforted. To have spoken about her lover was in itself much, and to have spoken about him as she had done seemed almost to have brought him once more near to her. Ruth had declared that Anton was sad, and had suggested to Nina that the cause of his sadness was the same as her own. There could not but be comfort in this. If he really wished to see her, would he not come over to the Kleinseite? There could be no reason why he should not visit the girl he intended to marry, and whom he was longing to see. Of course he had business which must occupy his time. He could not give up every moment to thoughts of love as she could do. She told herself all this, and once more endeavoured to be comforted. And then she unpacked the basket. There were fresh eggs, and a quantity of jelly, and some soup in a jug ready to be made hot, and such delicacies as invalids will eat when their appetites will serve for nothing else. And Nina, as she took these things out, thought only of her father. She took them as coming for him altogether, without any reference to her own use. But at the bottom of the basket there were stockings, and a handkerchief or two, and a petticoat, and a pair of shoes. Should she throw them out among the ashes behind the kitchen, or should she press them to her bosom as treasures to be loved as long as a single thread of them might hang together? She had taken such alms before, from her aunt Sophie, taking them in bitterness of spirit, and wearing them as though they were made of sackcloth, very sore to the skin. The acceptance of such things, even from her aunt, had been gall to her. But in the old days no idea of refusing them had come to her. Of course she must submit herself to her aunt's charity because of her father's poverty. And garments had come to her which were old and worn, bearing unmistakable signs of Lotta's coarse but reparative energies, raiment against which her feminine niceness would have rebelled, had it been possible for her in her misfortunes to indulge her feminine niceness. But there was a sweet scent of last summer's roses on the things which now lay in her lap, and each article was of the best; and though each had been worn, they were all such as one girl would lend to another who was her dearest friend, who was to be made welcome to the wardrobe as though it were her own. There was something of the tenderness of love in the very folding, and respect as well as friendship in the care of the packing. Her aunt's left off clothes had come to her in a big roll, fastened with a corking pin; but Rebecca, with delicate fingers, had made each article of her tribute to look pretty, as though for the dress of such a one as Nina prettiness and care must always be needed. It was not possible for her to refuse a present sent to her with so many signs of tenderness. And then she tried on the shoes. Of all the things she needed, these were the most necessary. At her first glance she thought that they were new, but she perceived that they had been worn, and she liked them the better on that account. She put her feet into them, and found that they were in truth a little too large for her; and this, even this, tended in some sort to gratify her feelings and soothe the asperity of her grief. "It is only a quarter of a size," she said to herself as she held up her dress that she might look at her feet; and thus she resolved that she would accept her rival's kindness. On the following morning the priest came, that Father Jerome whom she had known as a child, and from whom she had been unable to obtain ghostly comfort since she had come in contact with the Jew. Her aunt and her father, Souchey and Lotta Luxa, had all threatened her with Father Jerome; and when it had become manifest to her that it would be necessary that the priest should visit her father in his extremity, she had at first thought that it would be well for her to hide herself. But the cowardice of this had appeared to her to be mean, and she had resolved that she would meet her old friend at her father's bedside. After all, what would his bitterest words be to her after such words as she had endured from her lover? Father Jerome came, and she received him in the parlour. She received him with downcast eyes and a demeanour of humility, though she was resolved to flare up against him if he should attack her too cruelly. But the man was as mild to her and as kind as ever he had been in her childhood, when he would kiss her and call her his little nun, and tell her that if she would be a good girl she should always have a white dress and roses at the festival of St. Nicholas. He put his hand on her head and blessed her, and did not seem to have any abhorrence of her because she was going to marry a Jew. And yet he knew it. He asked a few words as to her father, who was indeed better on this morning than he had been for the last few days, and then he passed on into the sick man's room. And there, after a few faintest words of confession from the sick man, Nina knelt by her father's bedside, while the priest prayed for them both, and forgave the sinner his sins, and prepared him for his further journey with such preparation as the extreme unction of his church would afford. When the prayer and the ceremony were over, and the viaticum had been duly administered, the priest returned into the parlour, and Nina followed him. "He is stronger than I had expected to find him," said Father Jerome. "He has rallied a little, Father, because you were coming. You may be sure that he is very ill." "I know that he is very ill, but I think that he may still last some days. Should it be so, I will come again." After that Nina thought that the priest would have gone, but he paused for a few moments as though hesitating, and then spoke again, putting down his hat which he had taken up. "But what is all this that I hear about you, Nina?" "All what?" said Nina, blushing. "They tell me that you have engaged yourself to marry Anton Trendellsohn, the Jew." She stood before him, confessing her guilt by her silence. "Is it true, Nina?" he asked. "It is true." "I am very sorry for that, very sorry. Could you not bring yourself to love some Christian youth rather than a Jew? Would it not be better, do you think, to do so, for your soul's sake?" "It is too late now, Father." "Too late? No, it can never be too late to repent of evil. "But why should it be evil, Father Jerome? It is permitted, is it not?" "The law permits it, certainly." "And when I am a Jew's wife, may I not go to mass?" "Yes, you may go to mass. Who can hinder you?" "And if I pray devoutly, will not the saints hear me?" "It is not for me to limit their mercy. I think that they will hear all prayers that are addressed to them with faith and humility." "And you, Father, will you not give me absolution if I am a Jew's wife?" "I would 10 times sooner give it to you as the wife of a Christian, Nina. My absolution would be nothing to you, Nina, if the while you had a deep sin upon your conscience." Then the priest went, being unwilling to endure further questioning, and Nina seated herself in a glow of triumph. And this was the worst that she would have to endure from the Church after all her aunt's threatenings, after Lotta's bitter words, and the reproaches of all around her. Father Jerome, even Father Jerome himself, who was known to be the strictest priest on that side of the river in opposing the iniquities of his flock, did not take upon himself to say that her case as a Christian would be hopeless were she to marry the Jew. After that she went to the drawer in her bedroom and restored the picture of the Virgin to its place. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Nina Balatka by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. Father Jerome had been very mild with Nina, but his mildness did not produce any corresponding feelings of gentleness in the breasts of Nina's relatives in the Windberg-Gasse. Indeed, it had the contrary effect of instigating Madame Zamenoy and Lotta Luxa to new exertions. Nina, in her triumph, could not restrain herself from telling Souchey that Father Jerome did not by any means think so badly of her as did the others; and Souchey, partly in defence of Nina, and partly in quest of further sound information on the knotty religious difficulty involved, repeated it all to Lotta. Among them they succeeded in cutting Souchey's ground from under him as far as any defence of Nina was concerned, and they succeeded also in solving his religious doubts. Poor Souchey was at last convinced that the best service he could tender to his mistress was to save her from marrying the Jew, let the means by which this was to be done be almost what they might. As the result of this teaching, Souchey went late one afternoon to the Jews' quarter. He did not go thither direct from the house in the Kleinseite, but from Madame Zamenoy's abode, where he had again dined previously in Lotta's presence. Madame Zamenoy herself had condescended to enlighten his mind on the subject of Nina's peril, and had gone so far as to invite him to hear a few words on the subject from a priest on that side of the water. Souchey had only heard Nina's report of what Father Jerome had said, but he was listening with his own ears while the other priest declared his opinion that things would go very badly with any Christian girl who might marry a Jew. This sufficed for him, and then, having been so far enlightened by Madame Zamenoy herself, he accepted a little commission which took him to the Jew's house. Lotta had had much difficulty in arranging this, for Souchey was not open to a bribe in the matter, and on that account was able to press his legitimate suit very closely. Before he would start on his errand to the Jew, Lotta was almost obliged to promise that she would yield. It was late in the afternoon when he got to Trendellsohn's house. He had never been there before, though he well knew the exact spot on which it stood, and had often looked up at the windows, regarding the place with unpleasant suspicions, for he knew that Trendellsohn was now the owner of the property that had once been his master's, and of course, as a good Christian, he believed that the Jew had obtained Balatka's money by robbery and fraud. He hesitated a moment before he presented himself at the door, having some fear at his heart. He knew that he was doing right, but these Jews in their own quarter were uncanny and might be dangerous. To Anton Trendellsohn, over in the Kleinseite, Souchey could be independent, and perhaps on occasions a little insolent; but of Anton Trendellsohn in his own domains he almost acknowledged to himself that he was afraid. Lotta had told him that if Anton were not at home, his commission could be done as well with the old man; and as he at last made his way round the synagogue to the house door, he determined that he would ask for the elder Jew. That which he had to say, he thought, might be said easier to the father than to the son. The door of the house stood open, and Souchey, who in his confusion missed the bell, entered the passage. The little oil lamp still hung there, giving a mysterious glimmer of light which he did not at all enjoy. He walked on very slowly, trying to get courage to call, when of a sudden he perceived that there was a figure of a man standing close to him in the gloom. He gave a little start, barely suppressing a scream, and then perceived that the man was Anton Trendellsohn himself. Anton, hearing steps in the passage, had come out from the room on the ground floor, and had seen Souchey before Souchey had seen him. "You have come from Josef Balatka's," said the Jew. "How is the old man?" Souchey took off his cap and bowed, and muttered something as to his having come upon an errand. "And my master is something better to day," he said. "Thanks be to God for all his mercies." "Amen," said the Jew. "But it will only last a day or two, no more than that," said Souchey. "He has had the doctor and the priest, and they both say that it is all over with him for this world." "And Nina? You have brought some message probably from her." "No, no, indeed. That is not exactly, not to day, Herr Trendellsohn. The truth is, I had wished to speak a word or two to you about the maiden. But perhaps you are engaged. Perhaps another time would be better." "I am not engaged, and no other time could be better." They were still out in the passage, and Souchey hesitated. That which he had to say it would behove him to whisper into the closest privacy of the Jew's ear, into the ear of the old Jew or of the young. "It is something very particular," said Souchey. "Very particular, is it?" said the Jew. "Very particular indeed," said Souchey. Then Anton Trendellsohn led the way back into the dark room on the ground floor from whence he had come, and invited Souchey to follow him. The shutters were up, and the place was seldom used. There was a counter running through it, and a cross counter, such as are very common when seen by the light of day in shops; but the place seemed to be mysterious to Souchey, and always afterwards, when he thought of this interview, he remembered that his tale had been told in the gloom of a chamber that had never been arranged for honest Christian purposes. "And now, what is it you have to tell me?" said the Jew. After some fashion Souchey told his tale, and the Jew listened to him without a word of interruption. More than once Souchey had paused, hoping that the Jew would say something, but not a sound had fallen from Trendellsohn till Souchey's tale was done. "And it is so, is it?" said the Jew when Souchey ceased to speak. There was nothing in his voice which seemed to indicate either sorrow or joy, or even surprise. "Yes, it is so," said Souchey. "And how much am I to pay you for the information?" the Jew asked. "You are to pay me nothing," said Souchey. "What? You betray your mistress gratis?" "I do not betray her," said Souchey. "I love her, and the old man too. I have been with them through fair weather and through foul. I have not betrayed her." "Then why have you come to me with this story?" The whole truth was almost on Souchey's tongue. He had almost said that his sole object was to save his mistress from the disgrace of marrying a Jew. But he checked himself, then paused a moment, and then left the room and the house abruptly. He had done his commission, and the fewer words which he might have with the Jew after that, the better. On the following morning Nina was seated by her father's bedside, when her quick ear caught through the open door the sound of a footstep in the hall below. She looked for a moment at the old man, and saw that if not sleeping, he appeared to sleep. She leaned over him for a moment, gave one gentle touch with her hand to the bedclothes, then crept out into the parlour, and closed behind her the door of the bedroom. When in the middle of the outer chamber, she listened again, and there was clearly a step on the stairs. She listened again, and she knew that the step was the step of her lover. He had come to her at last, then. Now at this moment she lost all remembrance of her need of forgiving him. Forgiving him! What could there be to be forgiven to one who could make her so happy as she felt herself to be at this moment? She opened the door of the room just as he had raised his hand to knock, and threw herself into his arms. "Anton, dearest, you have come at last. But I am not going to scold. I am so glad that you have come, my own one." While she was yet speaking, he brought her back into the room, supporting her with his arm round her waist; and when the door was closed, he stood over her, still holding her up, and looking down into her face, which was turned up to his. "Why do you not speak to me, Anton?" she said. But she smiled as she spoke, and there was nothing of fear in the tone of her voice, for his look was kind, and there was love in his eyes. He stooped down over her and fastened his lips upon her forehead. She pressed herself closer against his shoulder, and shutting her eyes as she gave herself up to the rapture of his embrace, told herself that now all should be well with them. "Dear Nina," he said. "Dearest, dearest Anton," she replied. And then he asked after her father, and the two sat together for a while, with their knees almost touching, talking in whispers as to the condition of the old man. And they were still so sitting, and still so talking, when Nina rose from her chair and put up her forefinger with a slight motion for silence, and a pretty look of mutual interest, as though Anton were already one of the same family, and touching his hair lightly with her hand as she passed him, that he might feel how delighted she was to be able so to touch him, she went back to the door of the bedroom on tiptoe, and lifting the latch without a sound, put in her head and listened. But the sick man had not stirred. His face was still turned from her as though he slept, and then, again closing the door, she came back to her lover. "He is quite quiet," she said, whispering. "Does he suffer?" "I think not. He never complains. When he is awake he will sit with my hand within his own, and now and again there is a little pressure." "And he says nothing?" "Very little. Hardly a word now and then. When he does speak it is of his food." "He can eat then?" "A morsel of jelly or a little soup. But, Anton, I must tell you. I tell you everything, you know. Where do you think the things that he takes have come from? But perhaps you know." "Indeed, I do not." "They were sent to me by Rebecca Loth." "By Rebecca?" "Yes, by your friend Rebecca. She must be a good girl." "She is a good girl, Nina." "And you shall know everything. See, she sent me these," and Nina showed her shoes, "and the very stockings I have on. I am not ashamed that you should know." "Your want, then, has been so great as that?" "Father has been very poor. How should he not be poor when nothing is earned? And she came here, and she saw it." "She sent you these things?" "Yes, Ruth came with them. There was a great basket with nourishing food for father. It was very kind of her. But, Anton, Rebecca says that I ought not to marry you because of our religion. She says all the Jews in Prague will become your enemies." "We will not stay in Prague. We will go elsewhere. There are other cities besides Prague." "Where nobody will know us?" "Where we will not be ashamed to be known." "I told Rebecca that I would give you back all your promises if you wish me to do so." "I do not wish it. I will not give you back your promises, Nina." The enraptured girl again clung to him. "My own one," she said, "my darling, my husband. When you speak to me like that, there is no girl in Bohemia so happy as I am. Hush! I thought it was father. But no, there is no sound. I do not mind what any one says to me, as long as you are kind." She was now sitting on his knee, and his arm was round her waist, and she was resting her head against his brow. He had asked for no pardon, but all the past was entirely forgiven. Why should she even think of it again? Some such thought was passing through her mind when he spoke a word, and it seemed as though a dagger had gone into her heart. "About that paper, Nina." "Accursed document! that it should be brought again between them to dash the cup of joy from her lips at such a moment as this. She disengaged herself from his embrace almost with a leap. "Well, what about the paper?" she said. "Simply this, that I would wish to know where it is." "And you think I have it?" "No, I do not think so. I am perplexed about it, hardly knowing what to believe. But I do not think you have it. I think that you know nothing of it." "Then why do you mention it again, reminding me of the cruel words which you spoke before?" "Because it is necessary for both our sakes. I will tell you plainly just what I have heard. Your servant Souchey has been with me, and he says that you have it." "Souchey?" "Yes, Souchey. It seemed strange enough to me, for I had always thought him to be your friend." "Souchey has told you that I have got it?" "He says that it is in that desk," and the Jew pointed to the old depository of all the treasures which Nina possessed. "He is a liar." "I think he is so, though I cannot tell why he should have so lied. But I think he is a liar. I do not believe that it is there, but in such a matter it is well that the fact should be put beyond all dispute. You will not object to my looking into the desk?" He had come there with a fixed resolve that he would demand to search among her papers. It was very unpleasant to him, and he knew that his doing so would be painful to her. But he told himself that it would be best for them both that he should persevere. "Will you open it, or shall I?" he said. And as he spoke she looked into his face, and saw that all tenderness and love were banished from it, and that the hard, suspicious greed of the Jew was there instead. "I will not unlock it," she said. "There is the key, and you can do as you please." Then she flung the key upon the table, and stood with her back up against the wall, at some 10 paces distant from the spot where the desk stood. He took up the key and placed it remorselessly in the lock, and opened the desk and brought all the papers forth on to the table which stood in the middle of the room. "Are all my letters to be read?" she asked. "Nothing is to be read," he said. "Not that I should mind it, or at least I should have cared but little 10 minutes since. There are words there may make you think I have been a fool, but a fool only too faithful to you." He made no answer to this, but moved the papers one by one carefully till he came to a folded document larger than the others. Why dwell upon it? Of course it was the deed for which he was searching. Nina, when from her station by the wall she saw that there was something in her lover's hand of which she had no knowledge, something which had been in her own desk without her privity, came forward a step or two, looking with all her eyes. But she did not speak till he had spoken, nor did he speak at once. He slowly unfolded the document and perused the heading of it. Then he refolded it and placed it on the table, and stood there with his hand upon it. "This," said he, "is the paper for which I am looking. Souchey, at any rate, is not a liar." "How came it there?" said Nina, almost screaming in her agony. "That I know not. But Souchey is not a liar, nor were your aunt and her servant liars in telling me that I should find it in your hands." "Anton," she said, "as the Lord made me, I knew not of it." And she fell on her knees before his feet. He looked down upon her, scanning every feature of her face and every gesture of her body with hard inquiring eyes. He did not stoop to raise her, nor at the moment did he say a word to comfort her. "And you think that I stole it and put it there?" she said. She did not quail before his eyes, but seemed, though kneeling before him, to look up at him as though she would defy him. When first she had sunk upon the ground she had been weak, and wanted pardon, though she was ignorant of all offence. But his hardness, as he stood with his eyes fixed upon her, had hardened her, and all her intellect, though not her heart, was in revolt against him. "You think that I have robbed you?" "I do not know what to think," he said. Then she rose slowly to her feet, and collecting the papers which she had strewed upon the table, put them back slowly into the desk and locked it. "You have done with this now?" she said, holding the key in her hand. "Yes, I do not want the key again." "And you have done with me also?" He paused a moment or two to collect his thoughts, And then he answered her. "Nina, I would wish to think about this before I speak of it more fully. What step I may next take I cannot say without considering it much. I would not wish to pain you if I could help it." "Tell me at once what it is that you believe of me." "I cannot tell you at once. Rebecca Loth is friendly to you, and I will send her to you to morrow." "I will not see Rebecca Loth," said Nina. "Hush! There is father's voice. Anton, I have nothing more to say to you. Nothing, nothing." Then she left him and went into her father's room. For some minutes she was busy by her father's bed, and went about her work with a determined alacrity, as though she would wipe out of her mind altogether for the moment any thought about her love and the Jew and the document that had been found in her desk. And for a while she was successful, with a consciousness indeed that she was under the pressure of a terrible calamity which must destroy her, but still with an outward presence of mind that supported her in her work. And her father spoke to her, saying more to her than he had done for days past, thanking her for her care, patting her hand with his, caressing her and bidding her still be of good cheer, as God would certainly be good to one who had been so excellent a daughter. "But I wish, Nina, he were not a Jew," he said suddenly. "Dear father, we will not talk of that now." "And he is a stern man, Nina." But on this subject she would speak no further, and therefore she left the bedside for a moment and offered him a cup, from which he drank. When he had tasted it he forgot the matter that had been in his mind, and said no further word as to Nina's engagement. As soon as she had taken the cup from her father's hand, she returned to the parlour. It might be that Anton was still there. She had left him in the room, and had shut her ears against the sound of his steps, as though she were resolved that she would care nothing ever again for his coming or going. He was gone, however, and the room was empty, and she sat down in solitude, with her back against the wall, and began to realise her position. He had told her that others accused her, but that he had not suspected her. He had not suspected her, but he had thought it necessary to search, and had found in her possession that which had made her guilty in his eyes. She would never see him again, never willingly. It was not only that he would never forgive her, but that she could never now be brought to forgive him. He had stabbed her while her words of love were warmest in his ear. His foul suspicions had been present to his mind even while she was caressing him. He had never known what it was to give himself up really to his love for one moment. While she was seated on his knee, with her head pressed against his intellect had been busy with the key and the desk, as though he were a policeman looking for a thief, rather than a lover happy in the endearments of his mistress. Her vivid mind pictured all this to her, filling her full with every incident of the insult she had endured. No, there must be an end of it now. If she could see her aunt that moment, or Lotta, or even Ziska, she would tell them that it should be so. She would say nothing to Anton, no, not a word again, though both might live for an eternity. But she would write a line to Rebecca Loth, and tell the Jewess that the Jew was now free to marry whom he would among his own people. And some of the words that she thought would be fitting for such a letter occurred to her as she sat there. "I know now that a Jew and a Christian ought not to love each other as we loved. Their hearts are different." That was her present purpose, but as will be seen, she changed it afterwards. But ever and again, as she strengthened her resolution, her thoughts would run from her, carrying her back to the sweet rapture of some moment in which the man had been gracious to her. And even while she was struggling to teach herself to hate him, she would lean her head on one side, as though by doing so she might once more touch his brow with hers, and unconsciously she would put out her fingers as though they might find their way into his hand, and then she would draw them back with a shudder, as though recoiling from the touch of an adder. Hours had passed over her before she began to think whence had come the paper which Trendellsohn had found in her desk. And then, when the idea of some fraud presented itself to her, that part of the subject did not seem to her to be of great moment. It mattered but little who had betrayed her. It might be Rebecca, or Souchey, or Ruth, or Lotta, or all of them together. His love, his knowledge of her whom he loved, should have carried him aloft out of the reach of any such poor trick as that. What mattered it now who had stolen her key and gone like a thief to her desk and laid this plot for her destruction? That he should have been capable of being deceived by such a plot against her was enough for her. She did not even speak to Souchey on the subject. In the course of the afternoon he came across her as she moved about the house, looking ashamed, not daring to meet her eyes, hardly able to mutter a word to her. But she said not a syllable to him about her desk. She could not bring herself to plead the cause between her and her lover before her father's servant. The greater part of the day she passed by her father's bedside, but whenever she could escape from the room she seated herself in the chair against the wall, endeavouring to make up her mind as to the future. But there was much more of passion than of thought within her breast. Never, never, never would she forgive him. Never again would she sit on his knee caressing him. Never again would she even speak to him. Nothing would she take from his hand or from the hands of his friends, nor would she ever stoop to take aught from her aunt or from Ziska. They had triumphed over her, she knew not how. They had triumphed over her, but the triumph should be very bitter to them, very bitter, if there was any touch of humanity left among them. Later in the day there came to be something of motion in the house. Her father was worse in health, was going fast, and the doctor was again there. And in these moments Souchey was with her, busy in the dying man's room, and there were gentle kind words spoken between him and Nina, as would be natural between such persons at such a time. He knew that he had been a traitor, and the thought of his treachery was heavy at his heart. But he perceived that no immediate punishment was to come upon him, and it was some solace to him that he could be sedulous and gentle and tender. And Nina, though she knew that the man had given his aid in destroying her, bore with him not only without a hard word, but almost without a severe thought. What did it matter what such a one as Souchey could do? In the middle watches of that night the old man died, and Nina was alone in the world. Souchey indeed was with her in the house, and took from her all painful charge of the bed at which now her care could no longer be of use. And early in the morning, while it was yet dark, Lotta came down and spoke words to her of which she remembered nothing. And then she knew that her aunt Sophie was there, and that some offers were made to her, at which she only shook her head. "Of course you will come up to us," aunt Sophie said, and she made many more suggestions, in answer to all of which Nina only shook her head. Then her aunt and Nina, with Lotta's aid, fixed upon some plan, Nina hardly knew what, as to the morrow. She did not care to know what it was that they fixed. They were going to leave her alone for this day, and the day would be very long. She told herself that it would be long enough for her. The day was very long. When her aunt had left her, she saw no one but Souchey and an old woman who was busy in the bedroom, which was now closed. She had stood at the foot of the bed with her aunt, but after that she did not return to the chamber. It was not only her father who for her was now lying dead. She had loved her father well, but with a love infinitely greater she had loved another, and that other one was now dead to her also. What was there left to her in the world? The charity of her aunt, and Lotta's triumph, and Ziska's love? No, indeed. She would bear neither the charity, nor the triumph, nor the love. One other visitor came to the house that day. It was Rebecca Loth, but Nina refused to see Rebecca. "Tell her," she said to Souchey, "that I cannot see a stranger while my father is lying dead." How often did the idea occur to her, throughout the terrible length of that day, that he might come to her! But he came not. "So much the better," she said to herself. "Were he to come, I would not see him." Late in the evening, when the little lamp in the room had been already burning for some hour or two, she called Souchey to her. "Take this note," she said, "to Anton Trendellsohn." "What? To night?" said Souchey, trembling. "Yes, to night. It is right that he should know that the house is now his own, to do what he will with it." Then Souchey took the note, which was as follows: My father is dead, and the house will be empty to morrow. You may come and take your property without fear that you will be troubled. By Nina, Balatka. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Nina Balatka by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. When Souchey left the room with the note, Nina went to the door and listened. She heard him turn the lock below, and heard his step out in the courtyard, and listened till she knew that he was crossing the square. Then she ran quickly up to her own room, put on her hat and her old worn cloak, the cloak which Aunt Sophie had given her, and returned once more into the parlour. She looked round the room with anxious eyes, and seeing her desk, she took the key from her pocket and put it into the lock. Then there came a thought into her mind as to the papers, but she resolved that the thought need not arrest her, and she left the key in the lock with the papers untouched. Then she went to the door of her father's room, and stood there for a moment with her hand upon the latch. She tried it ever so gently, but she found that the door was bolted. The bolt, she knew, was on her side, and she could withdraw it, but she did not do so, seeming to take the impediment as though it were a sufficient bar against her entrance. Then she ran down the stairs rapidly, opened the front door, and found herself out in the night air. It was a cold, windy night, not so late indeed as to have made her feel that it was night, had she not come from the gloom of the dark parlour and the glimmer of her one small lamp. It was now something beyond the middle of October, and at present it might be 8 o'clock. She knew that there would be moonlight, and she looked up at the sky, but the clouds were all dark, though she could see that they were moving along with the gusts of wind. It was very cold, and she drew her cloak closer about her as she stepped out into the archway. Up above her, almost close to her in the gloom of the night, there was the long colonnade of the palace, with the lights glimmering in the windows as they always glimmered. She allowed herself for a moment to think who might be there in those rooms, as she had so often thought before. It was possible that Anton might be there. He had been there once before at this time in the evening, as he himself had told her. Wherever he might be, was he thinking of her? But if he thought of her, he was thinking of her as one who had deceived him, who had tried to rob him. Ah, the day would soon come in which he would learn that he had wronged her. When that day should come, would his heart be bitter within him? "He will certainly be unhappy for a time," she said, "but he is hard, and will recover, and she will console him. It will be better so. A Christian and a Jew should never love each other." As she stood, the clouds were lifted for a moment from the face of the risen moon, and she could see by the pale clear light the whole façade of the palace as it ran along the steep hillside above her. She could count the arches, as she had so often counted them by the same light. They seemed to be close over her head, and she stood there thinking of them, till the clouds had again scurried across the moon's face, and she could only see the accustomed glimmer in the windows. As her eye fell upon the well-known black buildings around her, she found that it was very dark. It was well for her that it should be so dark. She never wanted to see the light again. There was a footstep on the other side of the square, and she paused till it had passed away beyond the reach of her ears. Then she came out from under the archway and hurried across the square to the street which led to the bridge. It was a dark, gloomy lane, narrow and composed of high buildings without entrances, the sides of barracks and old palaces. From the windows above her head on the left she heard the voices of soldiers. A song was being sung, and she could hear the words. How cruel it was that other people should have so much of light-hearted joy in the world, but that for her everything should have been so terribly sad. The wind as it met her seemed to penetrate to her bones. She was very cold. But it was useless to regard that. There was no place on the face of the earth that would ever be warm for her. As she passed along the causeway leading to the bridge, a sound with which she was very familiar met her ears. They were singing vespers under the shadow of one of the great statues which are placed one over each arch of the bridge. There was a lay friar standing by a little table on which there was a white cloth and a lighted lamp and a small crucifix, and above the crucifix, supported against the stonework of the bridge, there was a picture of the Virgin with her child, and there was a tawdry wreath of paper flowers, so that by the light of the lamp you could see that a little altar had been prepared. And on the table there was a plate containing kreuzers, into which the faithful who passed and took a part in the evening psalm of praise might put an offering for the honour of the Virgin, and for the benefit of the poor friar and his brethren in their poor cloisters at home. Nina knew all about it well. Scores of times had she stood on the same spot upon the bridge and sung the vesper hymn ere she passed on to the Kleinseite. And now she paused and sang it once again. Around the table upon the pavement there stood perhaps 30 or 40 persons, most of them children, and the remainder girls, perhaps of Nina's age. And the friar stood close by the table, leaning idly against the bridge, with his eye wandering from the little plate with the kreuzers to the passers-by who might possibly contribute. And ever and again he, with drawling voice, would commence some sentence of the hymn, and then the girls and children would take it up, well knowing the accustomed words, and their voices as they sang would sound sweetly across the waters, the loud gurgling of which as they ran beneath the arch would be heard during the pauses. And Nina stopped and sang. When she was a child she had sung there very often, and the friar of those days would put his hand upon her head and bless her as she brought her small piece of tribute to his plate. Of late, since she had been at variance with the church by reason of the Jew, she had always passed by rapidly, as though feeling that she had no longer any right to take a part in such a ceremony. But now she had done with the Jew, and surely she might sing the vesper song. So she stopped and sang, remembering not the less as she sang that that which she was about to do, if really done, would make all such singing unavailing for her. But then perhaps even yet it might not be done. Lotta's first prediction that the Jew would desert her had certainly come true, and Lotta's second prediction that there would be nothing left for her but to drown herself seemed to her to be true also. She had left the house in which her father's dead body was still lying with this purpose. Doubly deserted as she now was by lover and father, she could live no longer. It might, however, be possible that that saint who was so powerful over the waters might yet do something for her, might yet interpose on her behalf, knowing as he did, of course, that all idea of marriage between her, a Christian, and her Jew lover had been abandoned. At any rate she stood and sang the hymn, and when there came the accustomed lull at the end of the verse, she felt in her pocket for a coin, and taking a piece of 10 kreuzers, she stepped quickly up to the plate and put it in. A day or two ago 10 kreuzers was an important portion of the little sum which she still had left in hand, but now 10 kreuzers could do nothing for her. It was at any rate better that the friar should have it than that her money should go with her down into the blackness of the river. Nevertheless she did not give the friar all. She saw one girl whispering to another as she stepped up to the table, and she heard her own name. "That is Nina Balatka." And then there was an answer which she did not hear, but which she was sure referred to the Jew. The girls looked at her with angry eyes, and she longed to stop and explain to them that she was no longer betrothed to the Jew. Then perhaps they would be gentle with her, and she might yet hear a kind word spoken to her before she went. But she did not speak to them. No, she would never speak to man or woman again. What was the use of speaking now? No sympathy that she could receive would go deep enough to give relief to such wounds as hers. As she dropped her piece of money into the plate, her eyes met those of the friar, and she recognised at once a man whom she had known years ago at the same spot and engaged in the same work. He was old and haggard and thin and grey and very dirty, but there came a smile over his face as he also recognised her. He could not speak to her, for he had to take up a verse in the hymn and drawl out the words which were to set the crowd singing, and Nina had retired back again before he was silent. But she knew that he had known her, and she almost felt that she had found a friend who would be kind to her. On the morrow, when inquiry would be made, and Aunt Sophie would certainly be loud in her inquiries, this friar would be able to give some testimony respecting her. She passed on altogether across the bridge, in order that she might reach the spot she desired without observation, and perhaps also with some halting idea that she might thus postpone the evil moment. The figure of St. John Nepomucene rested on the other balustrade of the bridge, and she was minded to stand for a while under its shadow. Now at Prague it is the custom that they who pass over the bridge shall always take the right-hand path as they go, and she therefore, in coming from the Kleinseite, had taken that opposite to the statue of the saint. She had thought of this, and had told herself that she would cross the roadway in the middle of the bridge, but at that moment the moon was shining brightly, and then too the night was long. Why need she be in a hurry? At the further end of the bridge she stood a while in the shade of the watch-tower, and looked anxiously around her. When last she had been over in the old town, within a short distance of the spot where she now stood, she had chanced to meet her lover. What if she should see him now? She was sure that she would not speak to him, and yet she looked very anxiously up the dark street, through the glimmer of the dull lamps. First there came one man, and then another, and a third, and she thought as her eyes fell upon them that the figure of each was the figure of Anton Trendellsohn. But as they emerged from the darker shadow into the light that was near, she saw that it was not so, and she told herself that she was glad. If Anton were to come and find her there, it might be that he would disturb her purpose. But yet she looked again before she left the shadow of the tower. Now there was no one passing in the street. There was no figure there to make her think that her lover was coming either to save her or to disturb her. Taking the pathway on the other side, she turned her face again towards the Kleinseite, and very slowly crept along under the balustrade of the bridge. This bridge over the Moldau is remarkable in many ways, but it is specially remarkable for the largeness of its proportions. It is very long, taking its spring from the shore a long way before the actual margin of the river. It is of a fine breadth, the side walks to it are high and massive, and the groups of statues with which it is ornamented, though not in themselves of much value as works of art, have a dignity, by means of their immense size, which they lend to the causeway, making the whole thing noble, grand, and impressive. And below, the Moldau runs with a fine, silent, dark volume of water, a very sea of waters when the rains have fallen and the little rivers have been full, though in times of drought great patches of ugly dry land are to be seen in its half-empty bed. At the present moment there were no such patches, and the waters ran by, silent, black, in great volumes, and with unchecked rapid course. It was only by pausing specially to listen to them that the passer-by could hear them as they glided smoothly round the piers of the bridge. Nina did pause and did hear them. They would have been almost less terrible to her had the sound been rougher and louder. On she went very slowly. The moon, she thought, had disappeared altogether before she reached the cross inlaid in the stone on the bridge side, on which she was accustomed to lay her fingers, in order that she might share somewhat of the saint's power over the river. At that moment, as she came up to it, the night was very dark. She had calculated that by this time the light of the moon would have waned, so that she might climb to the spot which she had marked for herself without observation. She paused, hesitating whether she would put her hand upon the cross. It could not at least do her any harm. It might be that the saint would be angry with her, accusing her of hypocrisy, But what would be the saint's anger for so small a thing amidst the multitudes of charges that would be brought against her? For that which she was going to do now there could be no absolution given, and perhaps the saint might perceive that the deed on her part was not altogether hypocritical, that there was something in it of a true prayer. He might see this and intervene to save her from the waters. So she put the palm of her little hand full upon the cross, and then kissed it heartily, and after that raised it up again till it rested on the foot of the saint. As she stood there she heard the departing voices of the girls and children singing the last verse of the Vesper hymn as they followed the friar off the causeway of the bridge into the Kleinseite. She was determined that she would persevere. She had endured that which made it impossible that she should recede, and had sworn to herself 1,000 times that she would never endure that which would have to be endured if she remained longer in this cruel world. There would be no roof to cover her now but the roof in the Windberggasse, beneath which there was to her a hell upon earth. No, she would face the anger of all the saints rather than eat the bitter bread which her aunt would provide for her. And she would face the anger of all the saints rather than fall short in her revenge upon her lover. She had given herself to him altogether. For him she had been half starved, when but for him she might have lived as a favoured daughter in her aunt's house. For him she had made it impossible to herself to regard any other man with a spark of affection. For his sake she had hated her cousin Ziska, her cousin who was handsome and young and rich, and had loved her, feeling that the very idea that she could accept love from any one but Anton had been an insult to her. She had trusted Anton as though his word had been gospel to her. She had obeyed him in everything, allowing him to scold her as though she were already subject to his rule. And to speak the truth, she had enjoyed such treatment, obtaining from it a certain assurance that she was already his own. She had loved him entirely, had trusted him altogether, had been prepared to bear all that the world could fling upon her for his sake, wanting nothing in return but that he should know that she was true to him. This he had not known, nor had he been able to understand such truth. It had not been possible to him to know it. The inborn suspicion of his nature had broken out in opposition to his love, forcing her to acknowledge to herself that she had been wrong in loving a Jew. He had been unable not to suspect her of some vile scheme by which she might possibly cheat him of his property, if at the last moment she should not become his wife. She told herself that she understood it all now, that she could see into his mind, dark and gloomy as were its recesses. She had wasted all her heart upon a man who had never even believed in her, and would she not be revenged upon him? Yes, she would be revenged, and she would cure the malady of her own love by the only possible remedy within her reach. The statue of St. John Nepomucene is a single figure, standing in melancholy, weeping posture on the balustrade of the bridge, without any of that ponderous strength of wide-spread stone which belongs to the other groups. This St. John is always pictured to us as a thin, melancholy, half-starved saint, who has had all the life washed out of him by his long immersion. There are saints to whom a trusting religious heart can turn, relying on their apparent physical capabilities. St. Mark, for instance, is always a tower of strength, and St. Christopher is very stout, and St. Peter carries with him an ancient manliness which makes one marvel at his cowardice when he denied his master. St. Lawrence, too, with his gridiron, and St. Bartholomew with his flaying knife and his own skin hanging over his own arm, look as though they liked their martyrdom and were proud of it and could be useful on an occasion. But this St. John of the Bridges had no pride in his appearance and no strength in his look. He is a mild, meek saint, teaching one rather by his attitude how to bear with the malice of the waters than offering any protection against their violence. But now at this moment his aid was the only aid to which Nina could look with any hope. She had heard of his rescuing many persons from death amidst the current of the Moldau. Indeed, she thought that she could remember having been told that the river had no power to drown those who could turn their minds to him when they were struggling in the water. Whether this applied only to those who were in sight of his statue on the bridge of Prague, or whether it was good in all rivers of the world, she did not know. Then she tried to think whether she had ever heard of any case in which the saint had saved one who had done the thing which she was now about to do. She was almost sure that she had never heard of such a case as that. But then, was there not something special in her own case? Was not her suffering so great, her condition so piteous, that the saint would be driven to compassion in spite of the greatness of her sin? Would he not know that she was punishing the Jew by the only punishment with which she could reach him? She looked up into the saint's wan face, and fancied that no eyes were ever so piteous, no brow ever so laden with the deep suffering of compassion. But would this punishment reach the heart of Anton Trendellsohn? Would he care for it? When he should hear that she had destroyed her own life because she could not endure the cruelty of his suspicion, would the tidings make him unhappy? When last they had been together he had told her, with all that energy which he knew so well how to put into his words, that her love was necessary to his happiness. "I will never release you from your promises," he had said, when she offered to give him back his troth because of the ill will of his people. And she still believed him. Yes, he did love her. There was something of consolation to her in the assurance that the strings of his heart would be wrung when he should hear of this. If his bosom were capable of agony, he would be agonized. It was very dark at this moment, and now was the time for her to climb upon the stonework and hide herself behind the drapery of the saint's statue. More than once, as she had crossed the bridge, she had observed the spot, and had told herself that if such a deed were to be done, that would be the place for doing it. She had always been conscious, since the idea had entered her mind, that she would lack the power to step boldly up on to the parapet and go over at once, as the bathers do when they tumble headlong into the stream that has no dangers for them. She had known that she must crouch and pause and think of it, and look at it, and nerve herself with the memory of her wrongs. Then, at some moment in which her heart was wrung to the utmost, she would gradually slacken her hold, and the dark, black, silent river should take her. She climbed up into the niche, and found that the river was very far from her, though death was so near to her and the fall would be so easy. When she became aware that there was nothing between her and the great void space below her, nothing to guard her, nothing left to her in all the world to protect her, she retreated and descended again to the pavement. And never in her life had she moved with more care, lest, inadvertently, a foot or a hand might slip, and she might tumble to her doom against her will. When she was again on the pathway, she remembered her note to Anton, that note which was already in his hands. What would he think of her if she were only to threaten the deed and then not perform it? And would she allow him to go unpunished? Should he triumph, as he would do if she were now to return to the house which she had told him she had left? She clasped her hands together tightly and pressed them first to her bosom and then to her brow. And then again she returned to the niche from which the fall into the river must be made. Yes, it was very easy. The plunge might be taken at any moment. Eternity was before her, and of life there remained to her but the few moments in which she might cling there and think of what was coming. Surely she need not begrudge herself a minute or two more of life. She was very cold, so cold that she pressed herself against the stone in order that she might save herself from the wind that whistled round her. But the water would be colder still than the wind, and when once there she could never again be warm. The chill of the night, and the blackness of the gulf before her, and the smooth rapid gurgle of the dark moving mass of waters beneath, were together more horrid to her imagination than even death itself. Thrice she released herself from her backward pressure against the stone, in order that she might fall forward and have done with it. But as often she found herself returning involuntarily to the protection which still remained to her. It seemed as though she could not fall. Though she would have thought that another must have gone directly to destruction if placed where she was crouching, though she would have trembled with agony to see any one perched in such danger, she appeared to be firm fixed. She must jump forth boldly, or the river would not take her. Ah, what if it were so, that the saint who stood over her, and whose cross she had so lately kissed, would not let her perish from beneath his feet? In these moments her mind wandered in a maze of religious doubts and fears, and she entertained unconsciously enough of doctrinal scepticism to found a school of free thinkers. Could it be that God would punish her with everlasting torments because in her agony she was driven to this as her only mode of relief? Would there be no measuring of her sins against her sorrows, and no account taken of the simplicity of her life? She looked up towards heaven, not praying in words, but with a prayer in her heart. For her there could be no absolution, no final blessing. The act of her going would be an act of terrible sin, but God would know all, and would surely take some measure of her case. He could save her if he would, despite every priest in Prague. More than one passenger had walked by while she was crouching in her niche beneath the statue, had passed by and had not seen her. Indeed, the night at present was so dark that one standing still and looking for her would hardly be able to define her figure. And yet, dark as it was, she could see something of the movement of the waters beneath her, some shimmer produced by the gliding movement of the stream. Ah, she would go now, and have done with it. Every moment that she remained was but an added agony. Then, at that moment, she heard a voice on the bridge near her, and she crouched close again, in order that the passenger might pass by without noticing her. She did not wish that any one should hear the splash of her plunge, or be called on to make ineffectual efforts to save her. So she would wait again. The voice drew nearer to her, and suddenly she became aware that it was Souchey's voice. It was Souchey, and he was not alone. It must be Anton who had come out with him to seek her and to save her. But no, she should have no such relief as that from his coming sorrow. So she clung fast, waiting till they should pass, but still leaning a little towards the causeway, so that, if it were possible, she might see the figures as they passed. She heard the voice of Souchey quite plain, and then she perceived that Souchey's companion was a woman. Something of the gentleness of a woman's voice reached her ear, but she could distinguish no word that was spoken. The steps were now very close to her, and with terrible anxiety she peeped out to see who might be Souchey's companion. She saw the figure, and she knew at once by the hat that it was Rebecca Loth. They were walking fast and were close to her now. They would be gone in an instant. On a sudden, at the very moment that Souchey and Rebecca were in the act of passing beneath the feet of the saint, the clouds swept by from off the disk of the waning moon, and the three faces were looking at each other in the clear pale light of the night. Souchey started back and screamed. Rebecca leapt forward and put the grasp of her hand tight upon the skirt of Nina's dress, first one hand and then the other, and pressing forward with her body against the parapet, she got a hold also of Nina's foot. She perceived instantly what was the girl's purpose, but by God's blessing on her efforts there should be no cold form found in the river that night, or if one, then there should be two. Nina kept her hold against the figure, appalled, dumbfounded, awe-stricken, but still with some inner consciousness of salvation that comforted her. Whether her life was due to the saint or to the Jewess she knew not, but she acknowledged to herself silently that death was beyond her reach, and she was grateful. "Nina," said Rebecca. Nina still crouched against the stone, with her eyes fixed on the other girl's face, but she was unable to speak. The clouds had again obscured the moon, and the air was again black, but the two now could see each other in the darkness, or feel that they did so. "Nina, Nina, why are you here?" "I do not know," said Nina, shivering. "For the love of God, take care of her," said Souchey, "or she'll be over into the river." "She cannot fall now," said Rebecca. "Nina, will you not come down to me? You are very cold. Come down and I will warm you." "I am very cold," said Nina. Then gradually she slid down into Rebecca's arms, and was placed sitting on a little step immediately below the figure of St John. Rebecca knelt by her side, and Nina's head fell upon the shoulder of the Jewess. Then she burst into the violence of hysterics, but after a moment or two a flood of tears relieved her. "Why have you come to me?" she said. "Why have you not left me alone? Dear Nina, your sorrows have been too heavy for you to bear." "Yes, they have been very heavy." "We will comfort you, and they shall be softened." "I do not want comfort. I only want to go." While Rebecca was chafing Nina's hands and feet, and tying a handkerchief from off her own shoulders round Nina's neck, Souchey stood over them, not knowing what to propose. "Perhaps we had better carry her back to the old house," he said. "I will not be carried back," said Nina. "No, dear, the house is desolate and cold. You shall not go there. You shall come to our house, and we will do for you the best we can there, and you shall be comfortable. There is no one there but mother, and she is kind and gracious. She will understand that your father has died, and that you are alone." Nina, as she heard this, pressed her head and shoulders close against Rebecca's body. As it was not to be allowed to her to escape from all her troubles as she had thought to do, she would prefer the neighbourhood of the Jews to that of any Christians. There was no Christian now who would say a kind word to her. Rebecca spoke to her very kindly, and was soft and gentle with her. She could not go where she would be alone. Even if left to do so, all physical power would fail her. She knew that she was weak as a child is weak, and that she must submit to be governed. She thought it would be better to be governed by Rebecca Loth at the present moment than by any one else whom she knew. Rebecca had spoken of her mother, and Nina was conscious of a faint wish that there had been no such person in her friend's house. But this was a minor trouble, and one which she could afford to disregard amidst all her sorrows. How much more terrible would have been her fate had she been carried away to aunt Sophie's house! "Does he know?" she said, whispering the question into Rebecca's ear. "Yes, he knows. It was he who sent me." "Why did he not come himself?" That question flashed across Nina's mind, and it was present also to Rebecca. She knew that it was the question which Nina within her heart would silently ask. "I was there when the note came," said Rebecca, "and he thought that a woman could do more than a man. I am so glad that he sent me, so very glad. Shall we go, dear?" Then Nina rose from her seat and stood up, and began to move slowly. Her limbs were stiff with cold, and at first she could hardly walk, but she did not feel that she would be unable to make the journey. Souchey came to her side, but she rejected his arm petulantly. "Do not let him come," she said to Rebecca. "I will do whatever you tell me. I will indeed." Then the Jewess said a word or two to the old man, and he retreated from Nina's side, but stood looking at her till she was out of sight. Then he returned home to the cold desolate house in the Kleinseite, where his only companion was the lifeless body of his old master. But Souchey, as he left his young mistress, made no complaint of her treatment of him. He knew that he had betrayed her, and brought her close upon the step of death's door. He could understand it all now. Indeed, he had understood it all since the first word that Anton Trendellsohn had spoken after reading Nina's note. "She will destroy herself," Anton had said. "What, Nina, my mistress?" said Souchey. Then, while Anton had called Rebecca to him, Souchey had seen it all. "Master," he said, when the Jew returned to him, "it was Lotta Luxa who put the paper in the desk. Nina knew nothing of its being there." Then the Jew's heart sank coldly within him, and his conscience became hot within his bosom. He lost nothing of his presence of mind, but simply hurried Rebecca upon her errand. "I shall see you again to night," he said to the girl. "You must come then to our house," said Rebecca. "It may be that I shall not be able to leave it." Rebecca, as she led Nina back across the bridge, at first said nothing further. She pressed the other girl's arm within her own, and there was much of tenderness and regard in the pressure. She was silent, thinking perhaps that any speech might be painful to her companion. But Nina could not restrain herself from a question. "What will they say of me? No one, dear, shall say anything. But he knows. I know not what he knows, but his knowledge, whatever it be, is only food for his love. You may be sure of his love, Nina, quite sure, quite sure. You may take my word for that. If that has been your doubt, you have doubted wrongly." Not all the healing medicines of Mercury, not wine from the flasks of the gods, could have given Nina life and strength as did those words from her rival's lips. All her memory of his offences against her had again gone in her thought of her own sin. Would he forgive her and still love her? Yes, she was a weak woman, very weak, but she had that one strength which is sufficient to atone for all feminine weakness. She could really love, or rather, having loved, she could not cease to love. Anger had no effect on her love, or was as water thrown on blazing coal, which makes it burn more fiercely. Ill usage could not crush her love. Reason, either from herself or others, was unavailing against it. Religion had no power over it. Her love had become her religion to Nina. It took the place of all things both in heaven and earth. Mild as she was by nature, it made her a tigress to those who opposed it. It was all the world to her. She had tried to die because her love had been wounded, and now she was ready to live again because she was told that her lover, the lover who had used her so cruelly, still loved her. She pressed Rebecca's arm close into her side. "I shall be better soon," she said. Rebecca did not doubt that Nina would soon be better, but of her own improvement she was by no means so certain. They walked on through the narrow crooked streets into the Jews' quarter, and soon stood at the door of Rebecca's house. The latch was loose, and they entered, and they found a lamp ready for them on the stairs. "Had you not better come to my bed for to night?" said Rebecca. "Only that I should be in your way, I should be so glad." "You shall not be in my way. Come then, but first you must eat and drink." Though Nina declared that she could not eat a morsel and wanted no drink but water, Rebecca tended upon her, bringing the food and wine that were in truth so much needed. "And now, dear, I will help you to bed. You are yet cold, and there you will be warm." "But when shall I see him?" "Nay, how can I tell? But, Nina, I will not keep him from you. He shall come to you here when he chooses, if you choose it also." "I do choose it. I do choose it," said Nina, sobbing in her weakness, conscious of her weakness. While Rebecca was yet assisting Nina, the Jewess kneeling as the Christian sat on the bedside, there came a low rap at the door, and Rebecca was summoned away. "I shall be but a moment," she said, and she ran down to the front door. "Is she here?" said Anton, hoarsely. "Yes, she is here." "The Lord be thanked. And can I not see her?" "You cannot see her now, Anton. She is very weary, and all but in bed." "To morrow I may come?" "Yes, to morrow. And tell me, how did you find her? Where did you find her?" "To morrow, Anton, you shall be told whatever there is to tell. For to night, is it not enough for you to know that she is with me? She will share my bed, and I will be as a sister to her." Then Anton spoke a word of warm blessing to his friend, and went his way home. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Nina Balatka by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. Early in the following year, while the ground was yet bound with frost, and the great plains of Bohemia were still covered with snow, a Jew and his wife took their leave of Prague, and started for one of the great cities of the West. They carried with them but little of the outward signs of wealth, and but few of those appurtenances of comfort which generally fall to the lot of brides among the rich. The man, however, was well to do in the world, and was one who was not likely to bring his wife to want. It need hardly be said that Anton Trendellsohn was the man, and that Nina Balatka was his wife. On the eve of their departure, Nina and her friend the Jewess had said farewell to each other. "You will write to me from Frankfort?" said Rebecca. "Indeed I will," said Nina. "And you will write to me often, very often?" "As often as you will wish it." "I shall wish it always," said Nina. "And you can write. You are clever. You know how to make your words say what there is in your heart. But you have been able to make your face more eloquent than any words. Rebecca, dear Rebecca, why was it that he did not love such a one as you rather than me? You are more beautiful." "But he at least has not thought so." "And you are so clever and so good, and you could have given him help which I never can give him." "He does not want help. He wants to have by his side a sweet soft nature that can refresh him by its contrast to his own. He has done right to love you, and to make you his wife, only I could wish that you were as we are in religion." To this Nina made no answer. She could not promise that she would change her religion, but she thought that she would endeavour to do so. She would do so if the saints would let her. "I'm glad you're going away, Nina," continued Rebecca. "It will be better for him, and better for you." "Yes, it will be better." "And it will be better for me also." Then Nina threw herself on Rebecca's neck and wept. She could say nothing in words in answer to that last assertion. If Rebecca really loved the man who was now the husband of another, of course it would be better that they should be apart. But Nina, who knew herself to be weak, could not understand that Rebecca, who was so strong, should have loved as she had loved. "If you have daughters," said Rebecca, "and if he will let you name one of them after me, I shall be glad." Nina swore that if God gave her such a treasure as a daughter, that child should be named after the friend who had been so good to her. There were also a few words of parting between Anton Trendellsohn and the girl who had been brought up to believe that she was to be his wife. But though there was friendship in them, there was not much of tenderness. "I hope you will prosper where you are going," said Rebecca, as she gave the man her hand. "I do not fear but that I shall prosper, Rebecca." "No, you will become rich, and perhaps great, as great, that is, as we Jews can make ourselves." "I hope you will live to hear that the Jews are not crushed elsewhere as they are here in Prague." "But, Anton, you will not cease to love the old city where your fathers and friends have lived so long." "I will never cease to love those, at least, whom I leave behind me. Farewell, Rebecca." And he attempted to draw her to him as though he would kiss her, but she withdrew from him very quietly, with no mark of anger, with no ostentation of refusal. "Farewell," she said. "Perhaps we shall see each other after many years." Trendellsohn, as he sat beside his young wife in the post carriage which took them out of the city, was silent till he had come nearly to the outskirts of the town, and then he spoke. "Nina," he said, "I am leaving behind me, and for ever, much that I love well." "And it is for my sake," she said. "I feel it daily, hourly. It makes me almost wish that you had not loved me." "But I take with me that which I love, infinitely better than all that Prague contains. I will not therefore allow myself a regret. Though I should never see the old city again, I will always look upon my going as a good thing done." Nina could only answer him by caressing his hand, and by making internal oaths that her very best should be done in every moment of her life to make him contented with the lot he had chosen. There remains very little of the tale to be told, nothing indeed of Nina's tale, and very little to be explained. Nina slept in peace at Rebecca's house that night on which she had been rescued from death upon the bridge, or more probably lay awake anxiously thinking what might yet be her fate. She had been very near to death, so near that she shuddered even beneath the warmth of the bedclothes, and with the protection of her friend so close to her, as she thought of those long dreadful minutes she had passed crouching over the river at the feet of the statue. She had been very near to death, and for a while could hardly realise the fact of her safety. She knew that she was glad to have been saved, but what might come next was, at that moment, all vague, uncertain, and utterly beyond her own control. She hardly ventured to hope more than that Anton Trendellsohn would not give her up to Madame Zamenoy. If he did, she must seek the river again, or some other mode of escape from that worst of fates. But Rebecca had assured her of Anton's love, and in Rebecca's words she had a certain though a dreamy faith. The night was long, but she wished it to be longer. To be there and to feel that she was warm and safe was almost happiness for her after the misery she had endured. On the next day, and for a day or two afterwards, she was feverish and she did not rise. But Rebecca's mother came to her, and Ruth, and at last Anton himself. She never could quite remember how those few days were passed, or what was said, or how it came to be arranged that she was to stay for a while in Rebecca's house, that she was to stay there for a long while, till such time as she should become a wife, and leave it for a house of her own. She never afterwards had any clear conception, though she very often thought of it all, how it came to be a settled thing among the Jews around her that she was to be Anton's wife, and that Anton was to take her away from Prague. But she knew that her lover's father had come to her, and that he had been kind, and that there had been no reproach cast upon her for the wickedness she had attempted. Nor was it till she found herself going to mass all alone on the third Sunday that she remembered that she was still a Christian, and that her lover was still a Jew. "It will not seem so strange to you when you are away in another place," Rebecca said to her afterwards. "It will be good for both of you that you should be away from Prague." Nor did Nina hear much of the attempts which the Zamenoys made to rescue her from the hands of the Jews. Anton once asked her very gravely whether she was quite certain that she did not wish to see her aunt. "Indeed I am," said Nina, becoming pale at the idea of the suggested meeting. "Why should I see her? She has always been cruel to me." Then Anton explained to her that Madame Zamenoy had made a formal demand to see her niece, and had even lodged with the police a statement that Nina was being kept in durance in the Jews' quarter. But the accusation was too manifestly false to receive attention even when made against a Jew, and Nina had reached an age which allowed her to choose her own friends without interposition from the law. "Only," said Anton, "it is necessary that you should know your own mind." "I do know it," said Nina eagerly. And she saw Madame Zamenoy no more, nor her uncle Karil, nor her cousin Ziska. Though she lived in the same city with them for 3 months after the night on which she had been taken to Rebecca's house, she never again was brought into contact with her relations. Lotta she once saw when walking in the street with Ruth, and Lotta too saw her and endeavoured to address her, but Nina fled, to the great delight of Ruth who ran with her, and Lotta Luxa was left behind at the street corner. I do not know that Nina ever had a more clearly defined idea of the trick that Lotta had played upon her than was conveyed to her by the sight of the deed as it was taken from her desk, and the knowledge that Souchey had put her lover upon the track. She soon learned that she was acquitted altogether by Anton, and she did not care for learning more. Of course there had been a trick. Of course there had been deceit. Of course her aunt and Lotta Luxa and Ziska, who was the worst of them all, had had their hands in it. But what did it signify? They had failed, and she had been successful. Why need she inquire farther? But Souchey, who repented himself thoroughly of his treachery, spoke his mind freely to Lotta Luxa. "No," said he, "not if you had 10 times as many florins, and were twice as clever, for you nearly drove me to be the murderer of my mistress." End of Chapter 16. End of Nina Balatka by Anthony Trollope.